Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for tuning into today's Author Talk series brought to you by the Library Speakers Consortium. The Library Speakers Consortium is a partnership of more than 500 library systems across the United States, Canada, and New Zealand with the goal of making Author Talks more accessible to communities of all sizes. I am Brandon Adler, your host and moderator in conversation with each of the acclaimed authors and presenters that you will hear from throughout our series. Today, we are so honored to have Smithsonian Curator Dr. Sabrina Sholts with us to talk about her book, The Human Disease: How We Create Pandemics from Our Bodies to Our Beliefs. Before we jump in, I want to give you all that standard housekeeping information that keeps everything running smoothly, and then I'll turn things over to Sabrina. We have compiled some questions that were pre-submitted with registration, but you may also submit questions during this presentation by clicking the questions button that's below the live stream video. So if you're already in full screen mode, you'll need to hit escape so you can see those tabs. One says questions, and that's where you submit your question. There are quite a few of you tuning in today, and we will take as many questions as we can during the Q&A period toward the end. As a reminder, there will be a link to the recording sent out to all registrants in about 24 hours. So if you have to leave early for any reason, no problem. You'll get a link to that in your email. Now, to formally introduce our guest for today. Sabrina Sholts is a biological anthropologist and curator of biological anthropology at the Smithsonian's National Museum of Natural History. Her research explores intersections of human, animal, and environmental health in the past and present. She received her PhD in anthropology at UC Santa Barbara and was a postdoctoral researcher at UC Berkeley in integrative biology and at Stockholm University in biophysics and biochemistry. Sholts has published widely in academic journals, including American Journal of Biological Anthropology, Environmental Health Perspectives, JAMA, PNAS, Scientific Reports, Proceedings of the Royal Society B, and Nature, Ecology, and Evolution, and written for popular audiences in Scientific American and the Smithsonian Magazine. She was named as a World Economic Forum Young Scientist in 2019, and most recently, has received the Presidential Early Career Award for Scientists and Engineers this year in 2025. Welcome, Sabrina. Thank you so much for being here. I will turn things over to you now.
Okay, thank you, Brandon. I trust that you can hear me. I also want to thank Frederick, who I met, who's behind the scenes, of course. Thank the Library Speakers Consortium for organizing this and inviting me to speak, and of course, to thank all of our viewers for being here today. Thank you, and happy to have this opportunity. And now that I've done my thank yous, I would like to ask you for a favor. Just a moment. Let me put up my screen here. Okay. Favor. Look at your hand. Yeah. Okay. Please, all of you. I know that this is virtual, and so I'll never know, but humor me, if you will. Just hold out your hand in front of you just like this. Okay. Now, when you look at the back of your hand, you can probably see the outline of some bones. All right, there are 27 of them in total. They're the long ones that make up your fingers and your knuckles, and then there are some kind of funny small ones that create those bumps around your wrist. These are the bones that give your hand its strength, and the muscles that attach to them as well give it its strength as well as its shape. Now, at the tip of each finger and thumb, you will see a hard plate of keratin, which we call a nail. They are nice for decoration, of course, but they have an important function too. They can help to protect and enhance our sensitivity to touch. Now, if you turn your hand over, you can see what they're protecting. There are these pulpy little pads, which happen to have the highest concentrations of sensory receptors in our skin. Now, with these pads, we touch everything, including other pads. Could you all make some powerful pad-to-pad contact for me right now, just like this? I trust that you can, because you're human. No other species has hands that can do this. And no other ape has such a long thumb relative to the other fingers, and no other primate can make them connect so forcefully. Okay, it's the difference literally of holding, a stapler, right? Like this versus, let's say, like that. Okay. And so because of these unique abilities, humans touch and hold things all the time, hundreds, thousands of times a day. It is one of the primary ways that we interact with our surroundings and with each other. Now look at your hand one more time, if you will. You know what you don't see? Microbes. Billions of microbes. Now, don't worry, most of them are harmless, and some of them, they can even be helpful. But some of these microbes can cause disease, and all of our touches can spread them, unless we wash our hands. So that's what this book is, that's what it's all about. It's about the ways that being human also make us vulnerable to infectious disease. Now, in a worst case scenario, those features can create and prolong a pandemic. But the good news is, I think, that we are largely in control. By understanding how we help pathogens spread, we can make better informed choices for personal and public health. Well, what are these features? It's a long book. I couldn't cover everything in this short talk, but a lot of it you can distill into those three categories, which I just put up on the screen. Three categories of risk, which I call the 3 Bs: biology, behavior, and beliefs. Now, our hands, they're part of biology. And as an example of how we can use them to spread disease, we can use the case of Mary Mallon. You may know her by the nickname of Typhoid Mary. Mary was a household cook who worked for wealthy families who lived around New York City in the early 1900s. She was also a chronic carrier of bacteria that caused a very serious illness called typhoid fever. She was a carrier, meaning that she was infectious, but she didn't show any symptoms. So Mary shed these bacteria when she used the bathroom, and she carried them into the kitchen on her hands. And then she used her hands to prepare and serve food, which caused a string of outbreaks in the families that ate her meals. Now, after public health officials realized what was happening, they arrested her and they actually quarantined her, first for a number of years, and then for the rest of her life. And to be clear, Mary, she didn't believe that she was hurting anybody because she didn't see how somebody who was healthy could make another person ill. And so for that reason, she refused to stop cooking. But the bigger problem was that she didn't care to wash her hands, which is something that people have been doing for thousands and thousands of years, long before anybody knew what bacteria were. And while her story provides, I think, plenty of fodder for a robust debate on public health versus individual freedom, it's her legacy, I think, that illustrates how small actions like hand washing are such a big deal. Now, our hands, they're part of our biology, but there are other disease-spreading features in our body too, and I'm using one of them right now as I speak. All humans, all have language, and all animals have some system of communication, but none of those systems come anywhere close to human speech with respect to sophistication. Our speech is another unique feature of our species, partly because we have a low voice box, which is known as the larynx, which you can see here in the green, and a flat face relative to other mammals, say, like that chimp there on the right. And, it may not look like it's a big difference, but it actually is. Our airways, we have tubes that form this equal-sided L, which I think is kind of like a boomerang, and very different compared to what you find, say, in a chimp, which has this more lopsided kind of hockey stick-like configuration. And so it's our anatomical arrangement. It's that boomerang combined with our supercharged human brain that allows us to make a huge variety of sounds and therefore an endless array of words. Now, unfortunately, our speech is also a brilliant mechanism through which we can spread respiratory diseases like flu, measles, and COVID-19. What do you think spreads pathogens more, speaking or, say, coughing? If you think it's coughing, well, I don't blame you, given that it's so much more forceful and that it's associated with illness. But that is actually not necessarily the case. And interestingly, we can go back to the time of Mary Mallon to find some of the earliest research on the function of speech in respiratory emissions and the spread of germs. That is when in 1903, on the other side of the Atlantic, there was a wave of flu that hit the House of Commons in the UK Parliament. And a bacteriologist named Mervyn Henry Gordon was brought in to investigate whether airborne transmission in the debating chamber may have had something to do with it. The debating chamber was a large room where the MPs would gather and talk, or as Gordon put it, articulate loudly. And at the time, it looked pretty much like it's shown here in the 1870s. And so to figure out how far microbes could travel in this environment from a single MP giving a speech, and therefore the extent of exposure risks that might be associated with it, Gordon did something really interesting. First he gargled with a liquid culture of a bacteria, Serratia marcescens, which was thought to be harmless at that time. It's not. Today we know it's an opportunistic pathogen, but to my knowledge, Gordon wasn't harmed by using it as an indicator microbe in this experiment. In any case, so he filled his mouth with these bacteria, and then he got up to the dispatch box, which is that table there with those boxes. You can see it in the middle, and he did another thing that was very interesting and I think actually kind of charming. He recited Shakespeare for an hour. Now the room was empty of people. Nobody in sight. Because Gordon's audience was actually rows and rows of agar plates. Now these are petri dishes that are filled with a jelly-like substance derived from seaweed called agar, and it's a growth medium for microbes. So guess what? Well, microbes grew. Gordon found that just by speaking, as any one of the MPs would have done, his plates produced bacterial colonies up to 40 feet across the chamber, way up in the nosebleed seats. And so even though influenza is not caused by bacteria, but by viruses, which nobody knew back then, Gordon's experiment did show that human speech alone is an effective mechanism by which microbes could spread through the air. Now, recent research has actually gone much further to help us understand how speaking can be very effective at spreading respiratory pathogens. For starters, the particles that are emitted when we speak, they're very small. These tiny particles, they're generated during our speaking when our vocal cords are moving and vibrating in our larynx. And when our mouth, when the lips open, when the tongue separates, all of that. These are essentially the same mechanisms that you can see, at work as someone sings, like in the video there on the right. Now, what can make those emissions infectious? Well, these very small particles can carry very small pathogens, like influenza and measles viruses. And because of their small size, they can hang in the air for longer, and they can penetrate further into our respiratory tract if we're susceptible. And for these reasons, yes, speech can release many more particles than coughing, actually, up to 10 times more particles just by counting numbers alone. Forget reciting Shakespeare. And as we increase the amplitude of our vocalization, I guess you could put it articulate loudly, like Gordon did, the rates of particle generation go up. And like touching, most of us speak all the time. One study found that adults speak an average of about 16,000 words a day. And in the past 5 minutes, I have probably used like 1,000. Now, the good news is that you're all watching this through a screen, okay? So you're safe. My respiratory emissions cannot reach you. But if we were in the same room, I couldn't say that. And it wouldn't be so unusual if we were. We are a highly social species, and we tend to gather as humans like to do. And so this is where we get to our second category of risk, which is behavior. Now, do not get me wrong. I love it when people come to see me speak, and I take it as a huge compliment, particularly when there is no food involved. And that is because sharing food and eating together, which is a behavior known as commensality, that is very much a human thing. Humans are obsessed with sharing food with each other. We share food more than any other primate species, with family, with friends. with people we don't even like or those we've just met. It's kind of weird, and until 12,000 years ago, this could have been a very helpful buffer against food shortages because, until that point, just about every person on the planet was foraging for food by hunting and fishing and gathering, right? And then 12,000 years ago, that's when we started the processes that led to agriculture. And today, where we produce our food, mostly by farming, growing it. Yet, sharing food is no less important to humanity. Why is that? Well, it's because it's an important means by which we create and express and reinforce feelings of trust and intimacy and kinship. It is now very much part of how we connect to each other socially and culturally. And unfortunately, when we share meals, we can share pathogens too. Some of the earliest evidence of the airborne transmission of SARS-CoV-2, the virus that causes COVID-19, that came from restaurants. And throughout the United States, adults who tested positive for COVID-19 were about twice as likely to have reported dining in a restaurant in the 2 weeks before becoming ill. And that makes sense, I think, right? I mean, you just picture it. You're in a restaurant at a table with your favorite people and the food arrives. Well, even if you're wearing a mask, let's say, you need to take that off to eat. And so you're removing this barrier to your respiratory emissions. And then while you're eating, you're probably going to talk to each other, right? And then you're going to increase those emissions more. And then let's say drinks arrive. And now everyone's talking. And maybe we're talking a little bit louder, because we want to hear each other. And then we're increasing those emissions even more. And then we order more food and we need more drinks because we want to keep talking. And therefore, we're increasing our emissions as well as the length of time that we're exposed to them. That's a very typical experience in a restaurant. And for a lot of people, it is an irreplaceable bonding experience. Nobody wants to give it up. I certainly don't. And we don't have to. Because there are ways to make it less risky. Eating outside is a great option, or in a less crowded or well-ventilated space, depending on, the situation and the season, let's say. And make no mistakes, masks work. They do. And so can mask mandates. In Germany, for example, one study found that 20 days of mandatory mask wearing almost halved the rate of new COVID-19 infections in one region. And in another study in Bangladesh, the researchers found that a 30% increase in mask wearing translated to a 9% reduction in new cases. So whether it's required or not, it's just important to note that masks can be a valuable tool for lowering respiratory transmission, and everybody should feel comfortable and encouraged to use them. Now, food sharing is often involved in another human behavior that recognizes and reinforces our social connections. And it's behavior that's even harder to give up when you're asked. And that is caring for and honoring the dead. We are the only living species that buries its own. And evidence for this behavior goes back about 80,000 years into human prehistory. So attending a funeral and the other ways that we care for the deceased, those are some of the most human things that we do. And so that is why I don't need to tell anybody about the immeasurable trauma of the COVID-19 pandemic when people lost loved ones and couldn't see and mourn them. It's a really heartbreaking situation that is all too common when these final acts of love can prolong the spread of a disease. And one of the cruelest pathogens in this respect is Ebola virus. So during the 2014 Ebola epidemic in West Africa, where more than 28,000 people were infected, many of the cases were linked to healthcare work and funerals. Ebola is a disease that preys on compassion because the body fluids of Ebola patients are most infectious around the time of death, and they can remain infectious for days afterwards. And so when you combine these viral properties with cultural behaviors that involve washing and touching and kissing the deceased, which is the case in West Africa and many other places around the world, you get a public health nightmare. In Sierra Leone, for example, one funeral ceremony was linked to as many as 365 deaths. And so the kind of funerary behaviors that were spreading the virus, they had to stop. But you can't change these things by force, and you definitely can't just stop people from burying their loved ones without providing another way for them to care for them. And unfortunately, a lot of families experienced or feared a situation where people in masks with trucks would come and take away the sick and the dead without any opportunity to comfort them or say goodbye to them or even know what was going to happen to them. Many people would resist a situation like that, and a lot of people in West Africa did. So local religious and traditional leaders, they played a critical role, therefore, in developing and promoting burial practices that were both safe and acceptable for West African families and communities. These included modifications such as sprinkling water over the deceased instead of washing them. And actually here you see a photo of what was considered a safe and dignified burial ground for Ebola patients in Liberia, following a very traumatic period in which the government required all people known or suspected to have died from Ebola to be cremated, which went entirely against local practices and led to all kinds of forms of resistance that made the situation even worse. But these kinds of interventions worked after the necessity became obvious and the appropriate processes were undertaken, and the people who accepted them did help break that epidemic curve. Now, the story of the West Africa Ebola epidemic also highlights the third B, which is beliefs. Some people believed that the deceased would return and retaliate if they weren't buried properly, which made certain practices all the more important. And these beliefs are part of religion, which is one of the strongest forces in humanity that convenes people and creates communities all over the world. But religion can also be a divider. It can be one of the many ways that people perceive differences between each other through a process called othering. Now, the other is anybody outside of one's own group, whether it's defined by religion or race or class or nationality. Othering can have a lot of harmful effects, such as facilitating the spread of disease, of course, and justifying the scapegoating of others as its cause. I mean, what one of the first responders to an outbreak historically can be? Healthcare workers or the government or the Red Cross? Well, often it's xenophobia, which is the othering of foreigners. And case in point, how many people have heard of the Spanish flu? Yeah, I mean, I'm sure you have, because that's what the US and the British press started calling the influenza pandemic in 1918. And the French did it too. But you know what they called it in Spain? They called it the French flu. And in Senegal, it was the Brazilian flu. And in Brazil, it was the German flu. And ironically, it might have started in Kansas. But this kind of naming, it's a very quick way to assign blame. And we saw how quickly and well it can work during the COVID-19 pandemic. For example, in March 2020, President Trump started calling SARS-CoV-2 the Chinese virus on Twitter. And hashtag Chinese virus immediately skyrocketed by more than 17,000%. And this was part of a huge increase in anti-Asian hate that we saw here in the US within the next 18 months. There were more than 10,000 anti-Asian hate incidents reported. And like the pandemic, that's not actually over. A recent survey of Asian Americans in New York found that over half of the respondents have experienced harassments, threats, or physical attacks in 2023 alone. And sadly, this is not the first time that Asian Americans and specifically Chinese Americans have been targeted in this way. In the year 1900, plague emerged in the United States, and the first outbreak was in San Francisco. The first victim was a Chinese man in Chinatown, and so the Chinese were immediately singled out as the source of the problem. And they were an easy target because Chinese people had been persecuted in California ever since the gold rush. And in San Francisco, they were already the go-to scapegoat for smallpox. Health officials tried to quarantine Chinatown and mandate vaccination for only Chinese people who refused the shots. They tried to force cremation of plague victims by taking the bodies from their loved ones who hid them. And basically every racist and heavy-handed attempt to stop that spread failed. Nothing actually worked until one public health officer named Rupert Blue came onto the scene. You can see him in this photo. He's sitting in the front in the gloves, and he actually later went on to be Surgeon General of the United States. Before that, he led a first of its kind, outside the box health campaign in San Francisco to go after the real culprits of the plague outbreak, which were rats. Based on the latest plague research of the day, showing that the bacteria that cause plague were transmitted to people from rodents via fleas, Blue and his team launched a campaign to rat-proof Chinatown, which, make no mistake, absolutely needed it. The conditions were deplorable. They really were, but it had nothing to do with the Chinese residents who had no legal mechanism to own their properties or really any means to compel their landlords to maintain them. The environment was the problem, which Blue recognized. And by eliminating all the places where the rats could spread their plague-infected fleas to people, he ultimately brought an end to the outbreak. When the disease resurfaced a few years later in the aftermath of the San Francisco earthquake in 1906, Chinatown was actually the only part of the city that remained plague-free. But unfortunately, the bacteria that cause plague, they still exist in the US. They're still here for a few reasons. One being that plague is a zoonotic disease, meaning that the bacteria can be transmitted between many different animals, including humans. Another reason is that scapegoats are a distraction that makes it easier for zoonotic diseases to spread. And our human habit for othering is why it works like a charm. And so as the Chinese people in San Francisco were being attacked for spreading plague in the early 1900s, rats were spreading those bacteria. They were spreading Yersinia pestis to squirrels throughout the Bay Area. And Rupert Blue knew it. He knew it too. In 1903, he heard about a recent die-off of squirrels in the East Bay, and he investigated the possibility that plague was spreading there. But he couldn't prove his theory by finding an infected squirrel. Nonetheless, he warned the U.S. Surgeon General at that time about the potential risks for all of California. And then in 1908, Blue finally did confirm infections in several squirrels in the Bay Area. But by that time, he found that more than 1% of them were carrying the pathogen. And so today, in consequence, there's a lot of wild rodents in quite a few Western states that carry the bacteria that cause bubonic plague. Again, these are the same germs that caused the Chinatown outbreak, as well as, yes, that's right, the Black Death. And sure, yes, we have treatments now, and human cases, they're very rare, but they do still happen. Actually, in fact, there was a case just last summer in Colorado. And so I think there's a lot to learn from this situation, from this example, and its parallels with COVID-19. Compared to all the focus and the energy that's been put into understanding the origins of the COVID-19 pandemic, we've paid relatively far less attention to all the ways that we've been helping the virus spread and mutate across the natural world in people, pets, zoo animals, and in wildlife, which will allow it to reemerge. Researchers, for example, found, for instance, that SARS-CoV-2 was transmitted from people to white-tailed deer more than 100 times from 2021 to 2022. The routes of the transmission, to my knowledge, are still unclear. And that seems to me like a really important thing to know. Especially because in at least 3 instances, it may have transmitted back to humans in a mutated form, creating new challenges for prevention and for treatment. And so events like these, they illustrate the importance of recognizing the interconnectedness of human, animal, and environmental health, which is a concept called, quite simply, One Health. It's the kind of thinking that prioritizes disease surveillance in wildlife and livestock, as well as in human populations, and is one of the ways that we can reduce our risks of zoonotic diseases by focusing on connections rather than divisions. Now, there's another form of othering that also facilitates the spread of disease that draws divisions based on beliefs about something that happens to all of us, which is getting sick. Absolutely everybody gets sick at some point, period, in their lives, usually without transforming how people see them or how they see themselves. If anything, illness should and often does elicit sympathy and care. But sometimes a disease can have so much social meaning that it can be the basis for othering. Somebody who wasn't deviant before may suddenly become so, or somebody who was may seem more so, when they're in the experience of a socially unacceptable illness. And when that happens, the compounding effects of social exclusion and rejection can make it even more difficult for that person to get well. And furthermore, they can make it even more likely that infectious disease is going to continue to spread. Now, social exclusion on the basis of disease, that's not unique to humans. Jane Goodall actually observed this kind of behavior among chimpanzees. For example, when some of them in a community became ill with a debilitating disease that may have been caused by a polio infection from a nearby human outbreak. The most severe case was a chimp that she called Mr. McGregor, who was an old chimp who became paralyzed in both his legs. And the way she writes about his experience is heartbreaking. She writes about how he struggled with this disability all of a sudden, pulling himself along the ground, using just his arms. He was swarmed with flies because he became incontinent. He dragged his body, just stiff and soiled until it bled. And worst of all, is how he was treated by his fellow chimps, once he got sick. They either physically attacked him or they kept their distance and they refused to touch him. And the only other chimp, who was probably his brother, the only other chimp who didn't abandon him, was with him until he died. And now, as sad as this treatment was to watch and even to read about, Jane Goodall actually wrote that it was the closest she's come to hating a chimp, to see how Mr. McGregor was ostracized. It's not clear that the chimpanzees attached any social meaning to the disease. A lot of animals practice social exclusion in order to reduce the spread of a disease within a community. Insects do this, and crustaceans, amphibians, and certainly mammals. But to blame the sick for their illness and to perceive them differently or poorly because of it, as far as I know, that's something that only humans do. And we can compare this, for example, to how people with polio have been treated historically by their fellow humans. In the 1940s, for example, there was a huge fear of polio among the American public, not only because it killed thousands of Americans a year, which it did, but because of the almost inevitable alienation and loneliness and pain and loss of earning potential that came from being disabled by it. Some polio patients, they wrote to President Roosevelt, a famous polio survivor whose amazing recovery, or so it seemed, gave hope to millions of people. But in reality, even FDR was not immune to these fears. He couldn't walk without significant support or stand without heavy leg braces, which you can see here in the photo. He made sure that the public didn't see him very much walking with help or using a wheelchair. And so the extent of his disability was actually unknown to them, to most of them anyway. And as historian David Dushinsky wrote, and I'm going to quote him here, to be crippled in this era was to be viewed as a moral failing, a sign of inner weakness, a character flaw requiring the person's removal from normal society. That was a fate that FDR couldn't afford to risk, and so he managed the effects of polio by appearing as if he was entirely healthy and unaffected by it. Now, polio is just one of the many illnesses that conveys social stigma, which means that it carries negative attitudes and beliefs about the people associated with it. The word stigma comes from the Greek language. It originally referred to a marking that was cut or burned onto a person's body in order to mark their unfavorable social status as a slave or a criminal or a traitor. Here we see it on this vase, the markings on the arm of this Thracian killing Orpheus. Those were stamps of otherness in ancient Greek society. Okay, they're brandings of shame. And from that word, we've come up with all other ways to apply this concept. Today there are endless conditions and circumstances that can be stigmatizing, and they're not just limited to infectious disease. We also stigmatize mental illness and addiction and obesity and poverty, just to name a few. But I think that there's no better example of a stigmatizing disease on a global scale anyway than AIDS. And here in the US, HIV stigma goes all the way back to the first known cases. Those appeared just in the corner of the New York Times in 1981. The first cases being reported in a small number of gay men. And so this unknown disease became immediately associated with homosexuality, even though women and a diversity of heterosexuals became increasingly affected too. And that link between this illness and homosexuality, that was reinforced with continuing reporting, as we see here from this headline in 1982. Some scientists, for a period of time, they were using the term gay-related immunodeficiency syndrome for the disease, and some people just called it gay cancer. And part of this is because homosexuality has been a cause of otherness in the United States since long before. Okay, it's an example where deviance became more so, right? Until the 1970s, same-sex relationships, they were illegal in every state in this country, and homosexuality was a mental disorder until 1973. And what I put up here, interestingly, was that when a classification, of homosexuality as a mental disorder was finally rejected, the New York Times reported that story and quoted an opponent to that decision who likened homosexuality and its consequences for an abnormal life to, and I'm not going to read this out loud, polio. Now, it's true that most of the earliest known AIDS cases were among gay men and seemed to result most likely from sexual transmission. Although it took a few years to determine that the primary routes of spread turned out to be unprotected sex, blood transfusions, and shared needles. By then it was solidly stigmatized in the beliefs of many Americans as a disease that only homosexuals got and deserved. And so for this reason, there was a lack of urgency and concern about AIDS in the mainstream society. And AIDS activism became essentially an act of survival. This famous graphic that we see here on the screen, this pink triangle with the word silence equals death, that refers to the kind of silence by political leadership in the US that was deafening in the face of the growing death count and the desperate need for medical treatment by AIDS patients who did not seem to matter. And in fact, President Reagan's first public mentioning of AIDS was in response to questions at a news conference about nationwide protests against children with AIDS in classrooms. This was after 4 years, since the start of the pandemic, and of course thousands of deaths. And the protests in question, they were actually about, they concerned Ryan White, a 13-year-old who was infected with HIV from a contaminated treatment for hemophilia. And he'd been refused entry to his school, even though it was known by that point that you couldn't get AIDS from casual contact. And so Ryan died of AIDS in 1990, right before graduating from high school, unfortunately. But during his short life, he changed the face of AIDS for a lot of people. And he did a lot to combat HIV stigma because he helped people see that anybody could be infected, even a child, and through no way that might be perceived as their fault. And it's worth noting here that shortly after he died, a major piece of AIDS legislation called the Ryan White Care Act was signed into law. And those programs remain the largest provider of services for people living with HIV/AIDS in the US today. And PEPFAR, which has also very much been in the news lately, that passed more than a decade later, and that's done, in some ways even more to provide life-saving care to people living with HIV/AIDS globally. And these are the kind of services that are now available for HIV testing and treatment. And they're exactly why stigma is such a huge factor in ending the HIV pandemic, just like it was a factor in how the virus spread. Stigma is what prevents people from knowing or being open about their status because they are afraid of prejudice and discrimination and abandonment and isolation. Around the world, there are people who are living in fear of people making assumptions or being suspicious about how they contracted HIV, which remains really strongly associated with stigmatized behaviors involving sex, for example, and drugs. but they're also afraid of facing a disfiguring and deadly disease, which so many people did in the 1980s and 90s. But medications have improved so much since then. It's a completely different situation today. Today, if someone is diagnosed and treated early enough in HIV infection, if their status is known and they can get those services, we have medications that can suppress their viral loads to a point where they cannot transmit the infection sexually. It's a fact that can be summed up very nicely as U equals U, undetectable equals untransmittable. And this is an example of a campaign that is helping educate people, with important, helpful, and accurate information about HIV. Too many people associate HIV infection with AIDS, which is the final and most severe stage of the infection, but it's certainly not inevitable. It's not a death sentence, not anymore. But, a lot of people still believe it is. And so that brings us to yet another way that our beliefs can help us spread disease, and that's through misinformation. Human beings have an awesome capacity for producing, sharing, and understanding information. But, as we all recognize, that doesn't mean all that information is true. And while a lot of incorrect information, sure, that can be trivial, like when you misremember details or you make harmless mistakes, some of it can have very serious impacts. Especially, I think, when it's shared deliberately, when it's designed, which is called disinformation. No other species inflicts as much self-damage as we do, as we manage to achieve by spreading faulty knowledge, and that is especially true when it helps the spread of pathogens too. For example, in South Africa in the early 2000s, the president Thabo Mbeki and his allies, they denied that AIDS was caused by HIV and endorsed theories that it was related to poverty and malnutrition. These ideas were actually informed by some prominent scientists in the United States at that time. Mbeki and other South African leaders, therefore, led many people to believe that life-saving antiretroviral HIV treatments were toxic, that they did more harm than good, and that herbal remedies were far more effective against the disease. Mbeki's government was therefore very slow to make antiretrovirals available for the South African population, which at that time had more people with HIV than any other country in the world. And they failed in that to provide treatments that could help prevent pregnant women from infecting their babies. And since then, Mbeki's policies and his misinformation has been linked to an estimated more than 330,000 deaths and 35,000 infant infections. In another example, by October 21st of the COVID-19 pandemic, it was estimated that between 2 and 12 million people in the United States were not vaccinated against SARS-CoV-2 because of misinformation. And pediatrician Peter Hotez, he's estimated that more than 200,000 of these people may have died needlessly, considering that every US adult was eligible for COVID-19 vaccines that were over 90% effective and protective against severe disease by May 2021. And so, I think it raises the question, is there something about being human that makes us susceptible to misinformation or predisposed to misinform each other? And it's not clear. In a 2018 study about the online spread of true and false claims, researchers found that falsehood diffused significantly farther, faster, deeper, and more broadly than the truth in all categories of information. Their data set consisted of rumor cascades on Twitter, back when it was Twitter, across the previous decade. And they found that falsehoods were 70% more likely to be retweeted than the truth, and thus reached 1,500 people 6 times faster. Now, the reason for these findings weren't really clear, but novelty, which is the quality of being new or unusual, that might have been one of them. The study's authors found that false rumors were significantly more novel than the truth, and that they got more replies that expressed surprise. Novel or unexpected things draw our attention, okay? Our attention being like a spotlight that illuminates a small piece of information and leaves everything else in the shadows. It's how we manage the limits of our supercharged brain's ability to receive information, even with its enormous capacity for storing that information. And novel stimuli, those are also more easily remembered by our brains than predictable or familiar ones. And that's possibly because of the ability to detect and respond to them being crucial for human survival in a rapidly changing environment. It's unclear, but the research continues. Now, one form of misinformation is the conspiracy theory, which has a murky place in human evolution. We'll just say that. Some researchers have argued that humans are prone to conspiracy thinking because we have a hyperactive agency detection system, and therefore we tend to ascribe intentionality where none exists. This is how some scientists explain our supernatural beliefs. Pattern perception, which is a core element of conspiracy theories, is also an ability that appears to have become somewhat enhanced through human evolution. But it's also been suggested that being suspicious of powerful and threatening groups may have been advantageous for human survival in earlier times. Again, it's difficult to say. But I will tell you that even if conspiracy theories have an unclear place in human evolution, their place in human history is fairly entrenched. We see the same stories and concerns across millennia, thousands of years, especially during epidemics. Just in one example, during an outbreak of smallpox in Montreal in 1885, as you see here, conspiracy theories provided fuel for an anti-vaccination riot. This is the kind of anti-vaccine propaganda that was produced at that time by a doctor by the name of Alexander Milton Ross, who accused doctors of promoting smallpox vaccination for financial gain. He was very busy. He also had a newsletter. He wrote pamphlets like this one, where he cast doubts on the efficacy and the safety of the vaccine by suggesting that, that it actually caused smallpox, as well as, potentially other deadly diseases too. And ironically, Ross is there. He was later revealed to have been vaccinated himself multiple times. And so I don't know about the rest of you, but to me, that sounds a bit familiar. And if it doesn't ring any bells for you, well, then, here's something else. In 1875, the New York Times ran this op-ed that expressed absolute shock that anybody would harbor absurd notions against vaccination. Couldn't believe that this triumph of modern medicine, would be rejected. And they blamed, the public's ignorance, for this, related to this, on medical quacks and on fortune tellers and even on scientists, okay, who are apparently writing above the heads of the common folk. And so this op-ed, it ended with an optimistic note that, when knowledge is more evenly distributed, there will be less of this fantastic and ignorant prejudice. And to me, distributed knowledge, that sounds a lot like the internet. And of course, the internet is not only just a source of misinformation, but we also have to consider how to balance all of that with ways that it can be a tool, right? Around misinformation and other things. The internet, I think it's one of the primary means that we can rapidly and efficiently combat false claims, right? In the sense that it does allow us to check our sources. We can examine supporting evidence, we can access resources, and even, get help from organizations that are actively involved in checking facts and, and making these kinds of efforts against misinformation. Here's just one example from the WHO, which is a lot of material that they put online. Their work on what they call flattening the infodemic curve. I won't forget, that the internet was how scientists were able to share the first SARS-CoV-2 genome so quickly, so broadly, and thousands since then, which allowed us to track and respond to that virus as it's continued to spread and mutate. So all I could say about that, I think, is that like any tools, you just want to be smart and thoughtful in using them the best way. And so I'll just close by saying that I've studied pandemics for the past decade, and in the end, I've come to a couple conclusions that I hope you'll take away from this talk. One is that humans create pandemics with the help of some unique human vulnerabilities. And two, that we can reduce our risks if we use our unique human advantages. No other species can innovate as we do, or has the brain power that we have, and few are as adaptable to change. And so to a large extent, I think that our pandemic future is in our human hands, and it's just a question of what we do with them. Thank you.
Thank you. So much amazing information, and we have a lot of really great questions. I'm going to start with, we had several people submit questions. You did mention that masks do help prevent the spread of disease, and people are wondering if they have to be those N95s only, or does that matter?
Sure, the quality of the mask does matter, absolutely, and how you wear it. N95s, they are most effective, but I've also read that this idea of perfection being perfection being the enemy of the good. Masks that are doing something for you are better than nothing in a lot of cases. But everything I've read does suggest that you do want to have a good fit. You want to have that really good material, and that's going to give you the best protection and probably what you're looking for, particularly if you're infected or you're in an environment where you think that there might be other people as well.
Mm-hmm. With that in mind, it makes me kind of jump to all the people who were asking questions about preparation for the next pandemic out there. So Mary from Mercer County Library System is saying, thank you for the presentation. How can the average citizen prepare for the next pandemic? Any practical things like prepping our homes ourselves? And what can we, Donna from another library is saying, what can we do now to prepare?
You could be healthy. Okay, first and foremost, a lot of people, during COVID-19, and certainly the case with other diseases, folks who are more vulnerable are those that have some kind of predisposition, for example. So taking care of yourself is one thing that you can certainly do. I don't think there's anything wrong with having, I have masks at home. You never know when you're going to want to have one. As well as, just thinking about, ways that you can keep things clean, wash your hands, of course. Even though we know, think about COVID-19, okay, the fomite transmission, right, what we call the surface sort of mediated transmission, was not a primary driver of that spread. Nonetheless, for other diseases, certainly that is the case. And there's not just one ever at one time. We certainly, can't, even though there tends to be sort of a limit on human attention for one disease at a time, one crisis at a time, comorbidity, the interaction of, infection with, multiple pathogens, that's constant. And so, we're by staying healthy in all the ways we know how, certainly help. There are things we can do as individuals, don't mess around with dead animals, or wear bug spray, think about that zoonotic transmission for sure. If you want to protect yourself or your family, what can we do as communities? We can, I think, talk to each other, and have these conversations maybe when it's not a crisis time. One of the reasons I ran out of time with my talk when I was talking about misinformation and what you can do, and that's kind of a high level list. But one of the reasons I wrote the book, something I found very valuable in the exhibits that I've developed on these topics, are that they really, to me, seem like opportunities to foster conversations, help people talk to each other. either directly about these issues or about other things that are really cool and interesting and somewhat related, and maybe you get there. But, unfortunately in this country and in others, but let's just say here, we all became so polarized and divided, and it all feels so political now. I think that ways that we can talk across those divides with family and friends and colleagues and neighbors, that's really important as well.
Yeah. Speaking of kind of the political atmosphere, we did have several people ask questions pertaining to that. Robert's question is, what impact, if any, will the US's departure from the World Health Organization have on responding to global disease outbreaks, in your opinion?
In my opinion, it's going to be hugely, hugely challenging for us to participate in any global effort and to stay informed about threats as they emerge. Okay, an outbreak anywhere is a threat everywhere. And so we are less safe for all of the ways that we have diseases spreading and being addressed, or responses that are without the resources that they previously had, because the US did provide so much funding to the WHO. So not only does that cut the legs out from that effort, but in the ways that I've also seen that, folks at the CDC aren't meant to be collaborating with, or I guess working with WHO colleagues. I mean, that's also just, that's not helpful in the situation of a globalized planet where we have all of these pathogens that know no boundaries and can cross boundaries and go around the world within a day.
Yeah. And Karen from Reading Public Library is also wondering if there are any concerns that future medical information that would be posted to the CDC might be incomplete or inaccurate or just not shared at all.
I don't blame people for being worried about that. I have the same concerns during the COVID-19 pandemic, when there seemed to be some political interference with what was being posted or published. I would say don't rely just on one source of information. Again, the internet, on the other side of the coin, you do have incredible resources. I find it's helpful to know on, the social media platform of one's choice who you trust, who you think knows their stuff, for example. Are they pointing to anything? What studies are they talking about? But certainly, we've got these governmental and intergovernmental, systems of information, of surveillance and information sharing. We've also got universities doing the same thing. University of Washington is one. Of course, Johns Hopkins is another one. Now, it's a concern when universities require federal funding to do that work and don't have it. That's another question. But going back to the original comment, wondering, I would say, yes, I don't blame anybody for having those concerns. And I would just say, always keep your eyes open and make sure that you're not becoming too siloed in where you're getting your information from.
Well, and we did have several questions about what are good resources outside of that. And especially for those who maybe don't have access to the paywalls that peer-reviewed articles often have. Lauren is asking, are there any good resources that we can follow today, especially seeing that so many good resources and organizations are being cut off from us right now?
Yeah. Harvard School of Public Health, the Chan School, they did a really good dashboard tracking people who were unvaccinated for COVID-19 back. I think they stopped in 2022, but that's just an example of one effort. They partnered with the New York Times to make some really good graphics. The dashboard for Johns Hopkins, again, as I mentioned, I mean, that was absolutely critical. So many people used it. We used it, for our exhibition at the Smithsonian. I would say, where else? Internationally, the Guardian is a really good non-paywalled newspaper. that I like to read online in English language, for example. I also like to read what people are writing and reporting in foreign countries, to the extent that I can. They've got really good health, public health systems and services in Canada, for example. That's another opportunity. And elsewhere. It's good to have a wide perspective on things.
Absolutely. And always check your library databases, because often your librarians will direct you toward free resources.
Yeah. And I will note that one of the other great things, there weren't that many, but I do think about the sort of the science aspect of what developed through the course of the COVID-19 pandemic. There's a lot of data sharing, and there was a lot of revving up of publication systems to make papers available early, quickly, but then also more and more academia is moving towards a model of open access publishing. And so to the extent that people want to go to the original source, and it's not easy always, but you should be able to read abstracts at least and get more information as well if you want to check something out. And I think you'll find that you're encountering less and less barriers to do so.
Absolutely. And if there is a paywall, again, back to the library, you can request
Absolutely. That's the whole point of
library loan. Yes. All right. Thank you so much for your time today, for all of the incredible information that you've imparted. It's been amazing. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Brandon. Thank you, everybody, for attending, and stay safe, be well, be healthy.
Yes. I echo that sentiment. Thank you to the audience members for joining. Without your support, none of this would be possible. So we thank you for choosing to spend your time with us. Below the live stream video in the resources area, you can find a link to The Human Disease: How We Create Pandemics from Our Bodies to Our Beliefs. We look forward to seeing everyone next week on February 11th when we chat with New York Times bestselling author Wabgizig Rice about his science fiction novel, Moon of the Turning Leaves. Be sure to register for this and lots of other great events on your library's event page. I'm Brandon Adler. Thank you for joining us.